One of the most powerful tools for expressing ideas and allowing a reader to perceive objects, experiences, scenes is comparison. It's one of the tools that writers in every genre employ regularly. It's kind of a double-edged sword, though, because it's also one of the ones that it's a technique that's very easy to overuse or to handle badly in your writing. So I want to focus in this lecture on some of the specific mechanisms for employing comparison in poetry, as well as other genres, but we'll be looking specifically at the context of poetry. A metaphor is a comparison, so is a simile, and symbolism. All of those involve representation that is accomplished by linking two things that ordinarily have no relationship. And in many senses, they are literal lies. When I say the moon is a face or a dime, I'm asking my reader to accept a lie as truth, not as a literal truth, but as an imaginative, perhaps ideological truth. So some of the basic vocabulary that we use to describe the various types of comparisons that are made in poems are some of the following words. So with a metaphor, there's a transference of qualities from one object to another object. And in a typical metaphor, the writer is asserting that one thing is something else. Now realize that the whole statement might not be present, but if a phrase contains an adjective or a verb that evokes some kind of object, then that is a metaphor by implication. So we have two terms for describing the two parts of the metaphor. So tenor refers to the thing that undergoes the transference, the subject of whatever comparison is being making. So in my phrase, the moon is a shiny dime high in the sky. The moon is the tenor. It is the thing that I'm describing, that I'm trying to help my reader visualize or perceive. The vehicle is the source of those transferred qualities. It is the object to which my subject is being compared. So in the moon is a shiny dime high in the sky, the shiny dime has the qualities that are being transferred to the moon. Now, is it true that the moon is a dime? Of course not. It's a planet, and it's very far away, and it's much, much larger than a dime. But in the moment when this perception is expressed, the similarities outweigh the differences. And that's how we know that a metaphor works. Within the specific context of that poem or short story or essay, the similarities are stronger, more relevant, and more powerful than all of the differences that would distinguish those two things from one another. A simile highlights the shared qualities between two objects, but does this by saying one thing is like another rather than asserting that one thing is another. A simile emphasizes some unexpected similarity, a striking resemblance that outside the context of that poem or that story or that essay we might not recognize. So another example, using the moon again. The moon is tucked behind clouds like a shiny dime in a beggar's coat pocket. The moon, again, is the subject of my comparison. I'm still suggesting that it is like a shiny dime, but I've softened that comparison a little bit by acknowledging that it's only like that thing. I'm not asserting that it is that sort of thing. A symbol is an object or image that represents something else through association or resemblance or simple convention. Often a symbol is some kind of material object, something that's tactile, perceivable, and it represents something that is invisible. So for example, from the novel The Scarlet Letter, that fabric letter stitched to Hester Prynne's dress is something tactile, physical, perceivable, but it represents her sin, it represents her shame, and that is something more ideological and abstract. Shame itself is invisible, but we can understand it and we can feel it. So the symbol is used to draw our attention to this abstract or invisible quality. Often the vehicle is present in the poem, which is this, like the letter, the scarlet letter. It's present in the poem, but the thing that it represents is implied. So a poetic example would be Frost's noiseless, patient spider. The spider is a symbol in that poem, but what the spider represents is implied through Frost's meditation on that spider. And I'll let you read the poem yourself and figure out what the tenor is. There are many common figures of speech, and these are imaginative gestures. They are gestures the poet makes in order to engage a reader's imagination and intellect by asking us to to follow inferences and to make inferences about things that are implied, perhaps, or to cross these kind of mental bridges that are connected among various elements in the poem or prose. So one figure of speech is synesthesia. This is a technique where you use the language of one sensory perception to evoke or describe a different sensory perception. So describing a person's voice as sharp, it's synesthesia because we give the voice something that is auditory, a tactile quality. Or describing a meal like ham and beans as heavy, again, we're giving something that we would experience through our sense of taste or smell, the tactile sensory qualities of weight. Describing a color or pattern on a shirt as loud. Again, we're assigning auditory qualities to something that is actually a visual perception. A couple other figures of speech that are often used are metonymy and synecdoche. With metonymy, the writer substitutes one thing for something that is commonly associated with it. So for example, rather than saying the members of the monarchy have less governing power than the elected officials who serve in parliament, that would be a very expository way of expressing that idea. We might use the figure of speech as a shorthand. So I might just say the crown has less governing power than parliament in modern British culture. Or I might say the White House is often crippled by a contentious relationship with Congress. I'm not speaking about the White House itself. I'm not speaking about the Senate room or the gathering of people. I'm referring to the individuals who work in those two contexts. Now, synecdoche substitutes a part of something for the whole, or in reverse, the whole for just one specific part. So an example is when we describe a really great car that a person has purchased or drives, we might refer to the car as wheels. Someone has a really fine set of wheels, or I like your wheels. When we say that, we're using synecdoche because the wheels are one part of the entire car, but when we say wheels, the reader or the listener understands that we're actually referencing the whole vehicle. Some other devices include things like a motif. This happens when we see multiple references to a certain category of images or objects. One of the examples that we read very early in the semester was Richard Wilbur's poem, The Writer, and all of the nautical imagery in that poem constitutes a motif because there are these various images, all of which belong to a certain category or set. A conceit is where you have a single metaphor that dominates or controls the structure of an entire poem. So the example Rowing by Jeffrey Harrison is a good example of a conceit. Another great example in our reading from last week is Harjo's poem at the end of the chapter, Perhaps the World Ends Here. She uses the table as a conceit because the kitchen table it extends across the whole poem, but it is this single image which keeps giving us more and more and more ideas or meanings. Personification is another familiar figure of speech. I've seen many of you using this in your poetry, but we also have good examples in the previous chapter. Ode to the West Wind is one. Keats's To Autumn is another one. Animism is similar to personification, except that in this case you assign animal behaviors or traits to human beings. So if we describe someone as bear-like, if we use the word pause or rooting in the dirt to describe a person's activities, we are assigning animal traits or qualities to that person. So how can we measure the art of comparison? What words might we use to gauge whether a comparison is working effectively in a poem? Well, one term we might use is aptness. And I have used this term in my comments to a lot of your poems. I have said a particular comparison or metaphor is apt. That means it's a strong comparison because the similarity being highlighted is appropriate. It seems to fit. It can be original, but once we encounter it, we think, of course, why have I never seen that thing in that particular way? Somehow that comparison expresses some element of the essence of that subject matter. Resonance would refer to the emotional and intellectual complexity of the comparison. Is it sophisticated? Does it think of a bell or a crystal goblet? When you tap the edge of the bell or the edge of that goblet, it rings. The sound continues for a while. A really good comparison will kind of ring or register in our minds for a while, and we have to ponder it a bit before we fully appreciate it. Surprise is the degree to which the comparison is startling and unexpected. Our goal in writing always, always, always is to illuminate. And metaphors that surprise us accomplish this kind of illumination because they give us something we weren't looking for, something we didn't expect. And once we receive that, it's difficult for us to forget that. Now, there are some traps to avoid with metaphor. One is a mixed metaphor, and this would be a failure to control the nuances of a comparison, where you just leap from one vehicle to another in a single sentence or poetic unit. So a couple funny examples would be statements like this: I wouldn't eat that with a 10-foot pole. Well, of course, nobody would eat anything with a 10-foot pole. We might say, we can argue about this until the cows turn blue. What I'm doing is combining this idea that this cliched familiar expression that something won't happen until the cows come home, which means later in the day, versus someone turning blue by holding their breath or being too cold. And so the writer has combined these things, and now the comparison makes no sense. Another example is, it's time to step up to the plate and get your house in order. Again, two metaphors are being mixed. This idea of stepping up to home plate where you're ready to bat, and then getting your house in order as a metaphor for taking care of tasks that need to be done in order to create closure or completeness in some process. A cliche is simply a dead metaphor. The comparisons have become so familiar and predictable that they don't startle us anymore. They don't surprise us. So saying that time flies is a cliche. Saying that a betrayal would cut like a knife is a cliche. Saying that someone is stubborn as a mule is a cliche. Or that something lasted an eternity. Those are all so familiar and overworn that they don't make any kind of mark on us. And so those are the things you don't want to use in your writing. I would encourage you to look back through the paper Nautilus for the symbolism of the shell. Look at similes in that poem and metaphors, such as comparing love to a fortress and the lines of the mane of a Parthenon horse to the shell itself. You can also see some really good examples of all of these figurative devices in the Blue Swallows, and as I've said, in Perhaps the World Ends Here.